Is there life after death? I ask this question the way a physicist asks about the origin of a star or the birth of a black hole. Define the thing, map the boundaries, test what survives contact with evidence. Is there life after death sounds like a single question, but it breaks into several smaller ones the moment I hold it to the light. What do I mean by life? Do I mean cellular metabolism, neurons firing homeostasis, humming along? Or do I mean the personal pattern I call me, the subjective point of view that remembers a childhood kitchen, a favourite song, a private promise? What counts as after A? Minute after the heart stops? A century after the body returns to carbon and calcium in the soil? And where would such life happen? Inside the closed circuits of a brain, outside in some independent realm, or spread across the records I leave in other people? And in the world I start here. Because the way science approaches any profound claim is by translating poetry into models that make contact with measurement and don't collapse when we add more data. I begin with the biology of dying because it is the clearest part of the picture. A living human is a self-correcting chemical storm, billions of cells, each keeping a voltage, pumping ions, repairing proteins, copying DNA making, and using energy. The heartbeat and breath are not the essence, but the support system that keeps a brain flushed with oxygen and glucose. When circulation stops, neurons lose their gradients. Within seconds, the brain slips into electrical silence. Within minutes, damage becomes irreversible because the chemistry of repair requires the very energy that's no longer supplied. If I write a little equation for that process in plain speech, it is this: the persistence of a living pattern equals energy in minus energy, lost to disorder, balanced by feedback loops that keep variables in range. Remove the energy flow and the feedback collapses. That's not cold, it's precise. It says that what we call life is a pattern held up against the universe's one-way current toward disorder. The universe is patient, is always pushing. We live by temporarily pushing back. I turn from cells to the person because that's where this question has weight. The pattern that is me is not my atoms. It is the arrangement updated second by second of activity across billions of synapses. The same carbon and hydrogen today will be different carbon and hydrogen next month as my body replaces itself. Yet I feel continuous because my brain continuously rewrites the pattern to include the last instant. If I need a metaphor, I use a flame, not the wood, not the ash, but the organized process of combustion fed by fuel and oxygen. The flame looks steady from a distance, yet the molecules involved change every microsecond. Me is like that, an ongoing process stabilized by inputs from the body and the world. When the inputs cease, the process ends. The wood can smolder, the ash can fertilize, but the flame itself does not migrate to a different log and keep burning as the same flame. It isn't cruelty to say this, it's respect for how extraordinary a living, remembering brain really is. I know the word after pulls me back toward time, and time is physics' most unforgiving teacher. The arrow of time is a statistical fact about the universe. There are far more disordered ways for matter to arrange itself than ordered ones. So systems tend to wander from order to disorder, from usable energy to waste heat. Life is the local exception that proves the rule. We carve out islands of order by exporting disorder to our surroundings. My cells do it, my brain does it with a vengeance, but the price of creating a mind that can say I is constant energy flow. When that flow stops, the island sinks. If someone hopes for an after that preserves the same viewpoint, the same sense of being located behind the eyes, the proposal must answer a simple demand. Where is the energy source and storage medium that keeps the pattern going once the brain is gone? If the answer is somewhere else, then somewhere else has to do more than feel comforting. It has to specify a mechanism that can be tested, or at least constrained by observation. I take seriously the reports often offered as evidence for survival, near-death experiences, tunnels of light, life reviews, the sensation of floating above a bed. They are human and moving. But I also take seriously what we've learned about brains under stress. Oxygen shortage can produce tunnel vision because the retina and visual cortex shut down from the periphery inward. The center survives longest, so the world narrows to a bright core. The life review can be understood as the brain desperately coordinating widespread networks in a last surge, the way damaged electronics sometimes dump many lines of code in a burst. Ketamine, anesthesia, awareness, temporal lobe stimulation, each can evoke vivid, emotionally charged body out of body sensations in people who are very much alive. None of this trivializes what people feel. If anything, it honors the power of the living brain to generate meaning, even at the edge of failure. But if I ask what these data say about a mind existing in the absence of a brain, the most honest answer is they don't. They are stories about what a brain can do under extraordinary conditions, not proof that a person's viewpoint persists without one. I ask, almost like a lawyer cross-examining an idea, I want to believe what would count as a prediction from the hypothesis. The personal mind continues after biological death. It would have to be more than some people will feel something unusual during crises, because we already know that happens. It might say, for example, that a person who has been clinically dead and then revived should be able to report verifiable information from a location they could not access by ordinary senses. Or it might say that messages from the dead offered under controlled blinded conditions will contain facts not accessible to the living participants but later confirmed in records. Those experiments have been attempted many times. The best of them are careful, the worst of them are theatre. What they share is a stubborn pattern of null results when proper controls are applied. Again, not mockery, just method. If an effect is real but small, it should emerge statistically across many trials. If it is large and robust, the thing people want to be true, it should be obvious. We have not seen either. I can almost hear an objection forming that consciousness might not be about energy and mechanism at all, that it could be fundamental in the way space and time are fundamental. If that were the case, then brains would be receivers or filters rather than generators of mind, and the mind might persist when the receiver breaks. I don't dismiss this out of hand. I note that it would upend a great deal we understand about how injuries to specific cortical regions change personality and memory, about how psychoactive molecules tweak receptor function, and alter the felt sense of self, about how developmental wiring differences shape a lifetime of thought and emotion. Every line of evidence we have ties subjective life to the biology of the brain in a tight loop. If I want to stand against that, I need a theory that explains at least as much and makes new predictions that come true. That bar is high because the accumulated evidence is deep. I also know that many people don't mean lab-proof survival when they ask this question. They mean something like, do I matter beyond my last heartbeat, to that I can give a clean, testable yes, but it won't look like a ghost. It will look like physics and information. The atoms in me will go on, and some of them will become grass and fruit and windblown dust, and eventually part stars again if the story is long enough. That is not a metaphor. It's how closed matter cycles and open energy flows shape everything from forest to galaxy. But the deeper answer is about patterns. The ideas I record, the kindness I give the harm, I avoid the skills, I pass the memories I plant in other brain. These are not vague legacies. They are real changes in the state of the world, carried as electrical patterns in other people and as symbols in notebooks and code. They persist with half-lives, of course. Memories fade, records decay, but they can also amplify. A sentence you say to a child can become a decision they make at 40, a law they help write at 50, a refuge someone else finds at 60. The self that makes that ripple doesn't continue as a single viewpoint, but it does continue as causation. And causation is the currency the universe never refuses. I want more than that at an animal level. I want reunion and the continuation of a voice I love, a small kitchen reassembled after the house has been torn down. I admit it. But I also want my beliefs to be rent paid where it counts in prediction, and in the humility to step back when reality says no. So I look for the versions of after that science can actually underwrite. One is genetic. The chain of molecules that built me is older than mountains and will likely outlast this age in other bodies. Another is cultural. The stories and tools that let us cooperate scale across generations far better than any individual does. Another is cosmic. The elements in me were forged in stars, and the clock that set all clocks, the expansion and cooling of the young universe, made it possible for stars to happen in the first place. When I say I will be part of the universe after I die, I don't mean it poetically. I mean that the map of where my atoms are will change, and the map of what my choices did will remain etched into other maps in ways that can be traced, at least for a while, like tracks in wet sand that harden into stone, I sometimes hear. But energy cannot be destroyed. Doesn't that mean my mind can't vanish? Energy conservation is a powerful law, but it is easily misapplied. What is conserved is the total energy in all forms. A brain's activity uses energy to maintain a specific arrangement ion gradients across membranes, synchronized firing across network. When the body dies, the remaining energy is converted to heat and chemical products. The specific organization that supported a mind is lost. Think of a house of cards. The cardboard is still there when it collapses, but the structure is gone. The confusion disappears when I remember that information and arrangement are not guaranteed by the conservation of energy. They require work to maintain, and death is exactly the absence of work in the relevant system. I also hear quantum physics leaves room for consciousness to persist. Quantum theory does leave room for strange behavior at microscopic scales, and it underlies the chemistry that makes brains possible. But no reliable evidence shows that quantum effects extend a person's mind beyond the death of the brain. The burden of proof here is heavy because the everyday functioning of neural tissue is well explained by classical biophysics plus standard chemistry. If a theory claims that quantum processes preserve personal identity after death, it must point to measurable consequences that differ from the predictions of ordinary neuroscience. Until then, invoking quantum mechanics changes the conversation's vocabulary, but not its evidential base. I do not say any of this to drain colour from the world. If anything, the opposite happens. Knowing that a mind is a rare, precarious arrangement that depends on rivers of energy makes me protective of it while it exists. It makes me careful with morning light, with friendships, with the attention I give and the attention I refuse to poisons that corrode it. It makes me want to make the kind of difference that can be traced after I'm gone, not because I'll watch it, but because the act of making it is the richest use of the time I have. It also gives me permission to say I don't know, at the edge cases, strange reports, unreplicated findings, without pretending that not knowing is a weakness. It's the doorway to better questions. I return to the beginning because repetition clarifies. I ask again quietly, now, is there life after death? If by life I mean the personal, first-person stream that remembers yesterday and plans tomorrow. The honest answer, based on what we can measure, is that it begins and ends with the living brain. If by after I mean something my atoms will do when they are no longer arranged as me, then yes, lavishly there is an after as soil and air, and perhaps one remote day as part of a star. If by life I mean the impact of my choices, then there is also an after for that in the altered trajectories of other people and in the artifacts I leave behind. If a new kind of evidence appears real, repeatable, surprising, I will revise my map because that's what it means to love truth more than I love any particular comforting picture. Until then, I live with an answer that is both bracing and beautiful. This is it. This brief blaze of ordered complexity is the entire miracle. We honor it by seeing it clearly, by giving more than we take while it burns, and by letting the world keep some warmth from our fire when the flame goes out. I want to dig further into what it means to be a continuing person, because under the microscope of neuroscience, the word I is stranger than it sounds at first. I think about split brain surgery cases where the thick bridge between the hemispheres, the corpus callosum, was cut to treat severe epilepsy. After the operation, the body is healthy, the memories are there, language still works, but subtle tests show two semi-independent streams of awareness that can want different things with different hands. The lesson is not that there are two ghosts in one skull. The lesson is that unity of self is a construction the intact brain performs in real time. When the construction pathways are altered, unity phrase, that matters for after because it shows how delicate and locally implemented the feeling of one continuous me really is. If the very unity of the present tense self can be split by a surgical line, then any claim that the same unity floats free when the whole organ stops working has to explain why it would remain intact in conditions far more disruptive than a neat medical cut. I pull on another thread that looks at first like philosophy, but is really about bookkeeping for identity. Suppose I step into a hypothetical teleporter that scans me to the last synapse, sends the pattern elsewhere, and assembles an exact copy. If the original is left alive, which one is me? If the original is disassembled, did I travel, or did a perfect duplicate wake up with my memories while I ended? These puzzles are useful because they force me to specify what I think the self is. If I say the pattern is what matters, then any faithful copy counts as me, even if there are two at once, which makes the word I branch. If I say numerical continuity matters the same physical process staying in motion, then a copy isn't me. It's a cousin who only thinks they are. No lab is teleporting people, but biology asks the same question quietly every day, because the body is a ship of Theseus. Proteins turn over, synapses reweight neurons, change their gene expression and their links as I learn. The only thing that persists is the ongoing process, and processes stop when their conditions are removed. I bring this abstract talk down to the clinic because the words we use there are precise. There is cardiac arrest when the heart stops pumping. There is clinical death, a period after arrest when there are no detectable vital signs, but resuscitation is still possible because some tissue, especially in the brain, is not yet irreversibly damaged. There is brain death, the complete and irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem that handles heartbeat and breathing reflexes. Brain death, unlike a coma or vegetative state, is death of the person under law and under physiology. No one wakes from it because there is no longer an organ capable of supporting wakefulness. This ladder of definitions exists because medicine learned the hard way that not all silences mean the same thing. A silent EEG can sometimes recover if the silence is brief and the underlying tissue is intact. A silent brainstem never does. When families ask whether someone is still there, this is what we are really checking. Is there any integrated neural activity left that can, with support, rebuild the fragile loop called the mind? I think about the reports of last surge's brief. Organized pulses of activity seen in some dying brains. They are not miracles, they are dynamic. Neurons are excitable cells coupled in networks. When metabolism fails, they can fire in synchrony for a short time the way a city grid might light up in unison just before the power plant goes dark. If someone is resuscitated during that window, they may report vivid imagery. If they are not, there is no mind left to report. This is not cynicism. This is a way of honoring cause and effect. It also suggests empathy. If a brain in its last minute can still make meaning, then the least I can do while I am alive is use my intact brain to make meaning on purpose for myself and for other people. I hear the quiet worry under many versions of this question. If the first-person stream ends at death, what stops life from being absurd? I answer with the most practical things I know. I answer with information and with thermodynamics. Information is a measure of arrangement of how unlikely a particular pattern is compared to the blur of possibilities around it. A page of random marks carries very little information because any shuffle looks like any other. A page with a proof or a recipe or a confession carries a lot because there are many more ways to be nonsense than to be that specific message. Life is concentrated information held in place by work, by spending energy to maintain unlikely arrangement. A single neuron pays constantly to keep ions on the wrong side of a membrane so that at the right moment it can suddenly let them flood back and make a signal. A mind is the echo of many such bets placed together. When I die, the book is not burned but unbound. Letters scatter into fertilizer and heat. That sounds stern until I realize the obvious corollary. While I am alive, I can write pages that will be copied in other minds, and those copies can be copied again. We usually call that teaching or friendship or culture. The physics name for the same thing is the propagation of low entropy structure across substrates. I pause on a tiny but beautiful physical rule that links information to heat. When any system erases a bit of information, when it forgets, it must release a whisper of energy as heat to the surroundings. You can picture a single switch going from unknown to known, costing a small fixed fee in warmth, if everything is done optimally. I bring this up not to do a party trick, but to underline the nature of forgetting and remembering. Brains are not perfect hard drives. They rewrite constantly and pay energy to keep anything at all. Memory is metabolically expensive. Meaning is metabolically expensive. That is why sleep, nutrition, oxygen and safety matters so much for a mind's clarity. If a thought feels effortful, it's because it is literally effort. If a society wants more people to think, well, it must pay the energy bills in food and medicine and time. I know that some people look to technology to extend the pattern cryonics, to pause decay brain-computer interfaces, to back up selves-generative models trained on a lifetime's language, to speak in a familiar tone after someone is gone. I keep my curiosity here and my caution. Cryonics bets on the idea that fine brain structure can be preserved at low temperature and that a future civilization could repair damage and restart the process. Maybe, but the burden of proof is immense. The preservation must be fine-grained enough to keep the synaptic weights and dendritic spines that embody memory. And the restart must restore not only a structure, but the correct dynamic of living tissue. Brain-computer interfaces today can read certain signals and write certain stimulations. They are medicine for paralysis and blindness and symptoms of psychiatric disease. A backup of a mind is something else entirely because memories and values are not a list, but a living loop. Generative models can synthesize plausible sentences in a loved one's style from many examples. That can comfort the living, but it is stagecraft, not survival. I say this gently because grief deserves honesty that does not break what it tries to hold. I look outward to how cultures manage the ache that facts alone cannot soothe. Rituals are technologies for nervous systems. They give the body something to do when doing nothing would tear it apart. Songs and prayers and shared meals coordinate many brains into one rhythm. That is not a metaphor either. It is synchronized breathing, an entrained motor cortex, and a softening of stress signals. I will not pretend ritual makes an afterlife factual. I will insist that it makes the present livable. I will also say that choosing a form of ritual, religious or secular, that keeps the promises it makes is a way of guarding dignity. If a ritual says we will remember, then write the remembering into calendars and stories and places so that the promise becomes a new fact in the world. I hold one more practical strand organ donation. When a person is dead by brain criteria, but their other organs are still perfused and viable, they can be transplanted to people who would otherwise die. The procedure is sober regulated and for recipients nothing less than a reopening of time. It is not life after death for the donor's mind, but it is life from death in a way that leaves the world measurably better. If I am looking for a form of continuation that science can notarize, this is it. I can sign a card now that says when my first person story ends, parts of me will literally keep other stories going. The act is small on a cosmic scale and huge on a human one. I come back to grief because any clean argument can feel like sandpaper against a wound. The mind that understands the laws of nature is the same mind that misses a voice and a smell and the warmth of a hand. Both are real. If I am the one who is dying, I want to know what to do with my remaining attention. I want to say things that put useful information into the future, passwords handed to the right people, letters signed with ordinary love instructions about practical matters that reduce confusion, stories recorded for grandchildren so that they can know more than a name. I want to set up the everyday physics of care so that the people I love do not have to spend their finite energy on paperwork and avoidable puzzles. And then I want to spend whatever time remains doing the most ordinary, beautiful things, eating fruit, listening to rain, apologizing where I was wrong, forgiving where I can, finishing small tasks so that others do not have to, and leaving spaces where laughter can still exist without me. None of that requires a metaphysical guarantee to be valuable. All of it becomes the way I write myself into the world beyond my last breath. I also ask what this outlook does to fear. If I believe that my first person stream will simply stop, I might worry that meaning collapses. But when I watch my own experience closely, I notice that non-existence is not an experience. It is the absence of any experience to have. The only place fear can operate is while I am alive, and while I am alive, I can shape the terms of my attention. I can look for work that leaves durable structure behind. I can invest time in people who amplify good. I can reduce avoidable suffering. This is not consolation prize thinking. It is the central prize of finite creatures who understand the game they are in. We are not waiting in a lobby for the real show to start. We are the show. I set all of this down and check it against my initial standards, define terms, trace mechanisms, ask for testable predictions, accept results. If by life after death I secretly wanted a guarantee of continued viewpoint, I do not have one to give. If by after I meant the persistence of atoms and the spread of influence, I have a framework solid enough to build a day upon. I leave a small door open not for superstition, but for discovery. If future careful work ever shows a reliable effect that indicates awareness detached from living tissue, I will change my mind with relief and curiosity. Until then, living honestly inside what we know feels like the most respectful way to spend the astonishing limited condition called a human life. I end where I began, because circling back is how minds consolidate learning. I ask the same question softly: is there life after death? If life means metabolism and homeostasis and a network brain generating a point of view, then the best map we have says it ends when the brain ends. If after means the continued journey of matter and the propagation of information and care into other minds, then yes, profusely there is an after that matters. We honor both truths by treating consciousness as the rarest configuration in the known universe, and by making sure that while it burns in us, it lights more than our own faces. I promised myself that if I was going to keep asking this question, I would also keep tightening my definitions so the answer gets sharper, not softer. I start with the simplest quantifiable thing about a conscious human life. It runs on about 20 watts. That is a small light bulb's worth of continuous power soaked up by a fistful of soft tissue that weighs roughly 2% of my body and yet claims about a fifth of my resting energy budget. Those watts are not just fuel in, heat out. They are exquisitely timed electrical and chemical transactions, ions pumped across membranes, neurotransmitters, released and reabsorbed, dendritic trees, reshaped by experience, long-range loops that synchronize and desynchronize dozens of times per second. If I ever want to imagine a personal perspective floating free of all, that I must first be honest about how much structure and energy it takes to make the everyday I show up each morning. We underestimate that cost because it's paid silently. I look at timing because consciousness is as much about when signals arrive as about what they encode. Sensory inputs arrive slightly out of step light, faster than touch sound arriving later. If the source is far away, yet I feel a unified present because the brain deliberately delays, predicts and stitches. In ordinary wakefulness, there are oscillations, alpha, beta, gamma bands that aren't mystical hums, but signatures of populations of neurons coordinating their work at characteristic tempos. Under anesthesia, these patterns flatten or flip into regimes that break long-range communication. In deep sleep, slow waves ripple like tides across cortex, briefly downing tools in local patches. In ketamine states, certain loops decouple while others gain noisy coherence. I'm not reciting trivia. I'm emphasizing that the continued sense of now as me is a fragile alignment problem solved in real time by living tissue. When the energy stops, the alignment goes with it. If an afterlife is supposed to preserve the same felt frame, then something somewhere must replace those watts and those synchronized delays with an alternative machinery. Saying it just does is not an explanation. It's the precise point where an explanation is needed most. I check my intuitions against the closure of known physics at human scales. The ordinary matter inside me is built from electrons and quarks arranged into atoms and molecules. The long-range forces that matter here are electromagnetism and gravity, with the short-range nuclear forces bound up inside atomic nuclei. The fields and particles of this standard model have been measured, cross-checked and stressed by experiments that probe far beyond the energies in a warm brain. If a persistent personal mind were made of some additional stuff or ran on some additional field that can move information and exert influence, that stuff or field would have to couple to the atoms in my head strongly enough to matter. And if it couples strongly enough to matter, we should already have seen it in the exquisitely sensitive experiments that look for new forces and particles. I don't say this to shut the door with arrogance, I say it to point at how well the hinges are already mapped. We know what it takes to push electrons around at body temperature, and nothing outside that catalogue shows up where a mind would need it to. I realise the word information risks turning airy if I leave it undefined, so I ground it in something I can touch. Take a single synapse, one of the tens of trillions that sculpt a human brain. Its weight is not a number written in chalk, it's a bundle of physical details, receptor counts, spine geometry, local protein phosphorylation states, vesicle release probabilities. Learning slightly changes those details, potentiates or depresses them by spending metabolic energy to arrange molecules into less probable configurations. That is what a memory is, not a ghostly imprint, but a lower entropy pattern paid for by ATP, and blood flow reinforced by replay during sleep and stabilized by entire cascades of gene expression. If I write an equation in words, it is this: memory strength equals prior structure plus energy invested in reconfiguration minus noise and decay over time. When life ends, the energy invested term becomes zero and the noise and decay term takes over. There is no violation of dignity in saying that. There is dignity in seeing how much effort a remembering brain spends to keep itself together. I then turn to time perception at the edge of crisis, because many sincere accounts of near death include the sense that a lifetime flashed by in a heartbeat, or that a tunnel opened toward a bright, peaceful center. What can create such intensity deprive visual cortex of oxygen, and it fails from the periphery inward, leaving a shrinking island of signal in the center of the field, a literal tunnel of light. Flood limbic circuits under stress and salience goes off the chart. The brain marks everything as important while failing to lay down durable time-stamped records. Jolt thalamocortical loops with an anesthetic or epileptiform burst, and unusual imagery can feel hyper-real because the predictive machinery that normally checks and edits sensations is offline. None of that says nothing happened. It says what happened was the brain in extraordinary conditions, doing what brains do, stitching, predicting, failing gracefully and sometimes failing spectacularly. If someone comes back from that brink, the report is part of the living world. If they do not, there is no recorder left. I widen the lens to personal identity again, but this time I push on the mundane. Every 7 to 10 years, much of my body's atoms have turned over. Proteins are continually replaced, even bones remodel. The ship of Theseus sails quietly through my days, while I insist honestly that I remained I. What keeps that continuity is not atom by atom persistence. It is the steady re-inscription of a pattern. The evidence for this is everywhere. Dementia's erosion of autobiographical memory shifts the felt center of a person not because a soul is stolen, but because the physical substrate for recalling and updating the story is being damaged. Focal brain injuries can alter temperament or moral judgment. Psychedelics can temporarily loosen the grip of the narrative self by altering serotonin-mediated gain on certain networks. These facts are often painful and sometimes therapeutic, but they all point one way. The self we cherish is a living pattern with moving parts. Patterns can, in principle, be copied, but copies are new processes with their own first-person centers, no matter how faithful the blueprint. If two identical processes wake up, they won't share a single viewpoint. Each will say, I, from within its own ongoing dynamics. I know the temptation to smuggle in quantum as a passport stamp, to cross the border from biology to metaphysics. So I treat the temptation with respect and scrutiny. Quantum theory governs chemistry. Without it, proteins wouldn't fold, enzymes wouldn't catalyze, and photosynthesis wouldn't harvest light. But the coherent, delicate quantum states that do miraculous things in superconductors or ion traps are fragile. They decohere quickly in warm, wet environments because interactions with countless degrees of freedom scramble phase relationships. Neural tissue is warm and wet and noisy by design. If a claim says quantum effects preserve personal identity after death, it must identify a concrete protected quantum system that outlives the body and continues to process and store the content of a mind. Naming the word is not naming the mechanism. I leave the door ajar for surprises, but I do not pretend that a vague gesture toward microphysics answers a macroscopic question. I do not, however, leave meaning to starve in the cold. The sobering physics of endings makes moral choices warmer, not colder, because it tells me exactly where leverage lives while I am alive. I can move information into the future in the form of skills taught well and kindness, given precisely the way a good engineer specifies tolerances, so devices keep working outside the lab. I can choose to reduce entropy in small human systems, families, teams, neighborhoods, by resolving confusion instead of feeding it by documenting what I know, so others do not waste their finite watts rediscovering it by designing rituals of remembrance that actually remind. If after means causal footprints, then I can lay them carefully. I can write letters that become part of someone's internal monologue years later. I can mentor in ways that measurably change trajectories. These are not consolations tacked on at the end. They are the very currency of continuation that every culture has used often without the physics vocabulary. I also face the new forms of digital remains with clear eyes. A language model trained on my emails could write plausible paragraphs in my style. A video synthesis system could make my face speak in that style. That can comfort or disturb depending on who controls it and how honestly it is labelled. I will not confuse such artifacts with me. I will not confuse pattern resemblance with persistence of viewpoint. But I can choose to leave behind clean, generous datasets of my work code with comments, essays, with references, decisions, with reasons, so that what mattered in my mind is more transferable than private quirks. The ethical distinction is simple tools that help the living do their living are valuable. Puppets that pretend the dead are still speaking are theatre and should be named as such. I keep a practical list because good philosophy should cash out in actions. Sign the organ donor registry so that if my brain irreversibly ends while my body can still give, I will add literal years to someone else's story. Appoint a medical proxy who understands what brain death means so that my wishes are not lost in a fog of terms. Write a password will so that my loved ones don't have to wrestle my accounts while grieving. Record memories that only I carry family stories with names and places because culture is a chain and breaks in the chain are preventable. Label pictures. Leave kindness notes where they will be found. None of this is cosmic, and all of it is cosmic in the only way that counts for finite creatures. It changes the counterfactual future in testable ways. I stop to ask whether the finitude I'm describing makes life smaller or bigger. For me, it makes it bigger because it turns every ordinary day into an event irreplaceable in principle. If I is a once-only process, then a walk under cheap streetlights in warm rain is not a placeholder for some later realer walk. It is the entire fact of a conscious universe doing that now. That sense does not demand despair. It demands attention. It asks me to spend my 20 watts well, to rest the machine so it can do beautiful work tomorrow, to avoid poisoning it with avoidable stressors, to learn enough about its biases that I don't mistake a reflex for a revelation. It also drags my ethics into the daylight. If other people are also once-only processes, then cruelty is not just wrong, it is waste on the only stage where anything can ever matter. I circle back, as I always do, to the compact form of the question and make myself answer it without flinching. Is there life after death? If by life I mean the biologically implemented, metabolically maintained information processing pattern that produces a first-person viewpoint, then all the weight of current knowledge says that life ends, when the brain irreversibly ends. If by after I mean the conservation of matter and the diffusion of my atoms into the world's cycles, then yes, I continue materially in forms that are not me. If by after I mean the propagation of information, care and influence into other minds and institutions, then yes, I continue causally in ways that can be traced and sometimes measured. If I someday see careful, repeatable evidence that awareness can persist without a living brain, I will let that evidence change me. Love of truth demands it. Until that day, I live as a creature of one brief blaze, trying to make more light than smoke. I give myself one last constraint, because constraints make art. I will allow only the gentlest repetition, the kind a mind uses to steady itself. I say, this is it. I say, this is it, and it is enough, if I make it enough. I say, this is it, and the way I spend it, writes the only after I can honestly promise. We can argue theories forever, but the ledger closes the same way for all of us. The miracle is not that the ledger closes, it's that it ever opened, and that for a while we get to decide what fills the lines. I keep circling the same hard kernel, because each orbit shows a new facet I hadn't noticed, and if the question's going to keep me honest, I have to keep the physics, the biology, and the lived human texture in the same frame. I start with the ordinary morning miracle that hides in plain sight waking. From deep sleep, the brain climbs a gradient of chemistry and connectivity, back to a state where a world appears and a first-person pronoun becomes possible. On the way up, fragments come online in a staggered order: thalamus gating, signals brainstem, tuning, vigilance, cortex, stitching sensations into a coherent now. The reappearance of I is not a binary flip, it's a phase transition, like water turning to ice or steam, depending on temperature and pressure, except here the control parameters are neurotransmitters, ion gradients, and oscillatory loops that either couple distant regions or let them idle. I watch that because it shows me how contingent the everyday miracle is. A tug on the chemistry, a disruption in the loops, and the self thins, blurs, or vanishes. We think of death as a cliff, but the mind already teaches us daily that continuity is a balance, not a guarantee. I examine memory again, not for sentiment, but for mechanism. Long-term memories consolidate through repeated reactivation. Sleep replay strengthens some traces and lets others decay. The process is selective, biased by emotion and relevance. Adrenaline tags can boost consolidation. Chronic stress can distort it. At the synapse level, structural changes in spines, the tiny protrusions where neurons talk, encode part of the trace. At the network level, distributed ensembles fire together, and by firing together, wire together. That slogan is cute, the underlying point is not. Memories are not stored in one place, and they are not stored in a single format. They are redundantly distributed fault, tolerant in some ways and fragile in others. If I damage a hub, I can lose names but keep faces. If I damage another, I can keep skills but lose stories. This mosaic teaches a sobering lesson that bears directly on the question person identity is a consortium of processes that can be pried apart. When the entire consortium loses power, there is nothing left to negotiate a reunion. I bring in time not as an abstraction, but as the background condition every explanation must respect. The second law of thermodynamics, the tendency for isolated systems to evolve toward more probable disordered states, doesn't read poetry or grant dispensations. Life gets its reprieve by not being isolated. We bathe in low entropy sunlight, we export our internal disorder as waste heat, we run little Maxwell's demons called enzymes that sort molecules and do work with exquisite local precision. The price is constant throughput. When throughput ends, the improbable arrangements unravel. A mind is the most improbable arrangement we know on Earth, because it keeps an enormous number of variables in a useful range simultaneously and uses the resulting stability to model the world, including itself. I can love that and still admit what follows the unraveling is not a failure of the design. It is the expected end state when the inputs cease. We are islands of negative entropy paid for by the wider sea. After the payment stops, the shoreline erodes. I ask whether the conservation laws offer a loophole. Energy is conserved, momentum is conserved, electric charge is conserved. None of these conservation laws says that specific organizations are conserved. A melody is not conserved when you drop a violin. The wood and strings persist, but the pattern requires a living player bowing at the right pressure and speed. Minds are like that, not conserved entities, but performances dependent on a tuned instrument, a score in flux, and the energy to play. What can be conserved are the consequences of the performance, the recordings, the students who learned the piece, the cultural taste for that kind of beauty. Those consequences are the sense in which I can keep playing after I am gone, but the player is not in those echoes. The player is in the vanished performance. I turn to evidence because I will not let the word after become a free pass for anything that feels good to imagine. The kinds of evidence that would shift my view are clear to name, even if they are hard to obtain. A person with verified sensory deprivation and clinical flatlines reports later details from a scene outside the room, details planted in advance and unknown to any clinician. A carefully controlled series of mediumship sessions produces names, numbers and private facts at a rate beyond chance, without any possibility of cold reading leakage or retroactive fitting. A laboratory setup detects interactions between biological systems and hypothesizes new fields that carry semantic information independent of neural tissue, with independent replication. I list these not to sneer, but to be specific. In their absence, what we do have are beautiful human stories of tumultuous internal experience near the border between life and death, stories that teach us how brains under stress behave and how meaning is made, but not stories that cross the explanatory gap. I recognize a deeper motive when people ask the question, and I let myself name it plainly. I want this not to be all there is. The desire is not childish. It is an adult recognition that love makes promises the universe doesn't always keep. Rather than shame the desire or pretend physics can satisfy it directly, I choose a third posture. Let the desire refine the way I spend the life I do have. If I cannot carry my viewpoint forward, I can still push value forward. I can build structures that outlive my metabolism, institutions that resist corruption because they audit themselves, habits in a family that reduce harm because they make repair the default, repositories of knowledge that lower the activation energy for someone else's discovery. I can also choose to engage grief with practices that the nervous system responds to. Coordinated breath slows autonomic storms. Shared narratives reframe helplessness. Repeated rituals reduce cognitive load when executive function is depleted by loss. These are not metaphysics. They are careful uses of bodies and minds. They do not conjure an afterlife, they dignify this life. I anticipate the simulation turn the suggestion that if reality is computation, a program could load my pattern into a new substrate after the biological run ends. Even if I grant the premise for the sake of discipline, two hard questions remain. First, what entity would both want and be able to do the loading, and what rules constrain it? Vague omnipotence is not a scientific answer. A specific capability in a specific world with specific constraints is. Second, even if a future agent rebuilds my pattern perfectly from a comprehensive biological scan, the me that wakes in the new substrate would experience continuity from inside its own start point. The biological me that ended would not have experienced the jump. Copies are new lives with inherited structure. They are not rescue missions for the original first-person stream. There is no cruelty in that. There is just the logic of processes. I pivot to the ethical cash-out again, because thought that doesn't change action is just a hobby. If consciousness is rare, expensive, and fragile, then society ought to align its incentives with the preservation and flourishing of mind. That means clean air and water not as slogans, but as synapse-protecting infrastructure. That means sleep as public health, not a luxury, because memory consolidation and emotional regulation are sleep-dependent. That means designing work that doesn't chronically shred attention, because attention is the gatekeeper through which a finite life becomes meaningful or squandered. On the personal scale, it means I choose to make my arguments in ways that preserve the other person's cognitive dignity, Steelman, instead of strawman curiosity, instead of scoring points, because other people's 20 watts are as precious as mine. I also talk about organ donation one more time, because it keeps showing up as the place where life from death is not a metaphor. A single donor can free multiple people from the queue where time runs out. The science here is not speculative. It is the most concrete form of continuation we have logged in surgical notes and survival curves. If I want a disciplined, testable way to turn an ending into beginnings I will never see, I can sign a paper today. We are squeamish about this sometimes because the boundary between person and body feels sacred. I agree it is sacred, and I argue that sacredness shows itself in the willingness to let my body be used to buy time for others when my person is gone. I return to the brain in its last minutes, not to linger morbidly, but to keep ore where it belongs. Even as oxygen dwindles and the metabolic dominoes fall, some brains produce an organized surge. a final orchestration that briefly couples regions in atypical ways. It is tempting to paint that surge as a door opening to somewhere else. It may be instead an intrinsic property of an excitable network entering a terminal regime. Either way, the right response is tenderness. The system that made a lifetime of mornings is retiring itself with the grace its physics allows. If I am present for someone else's ending, my job is to reduce noise, literal noise, and the noise of panic so the last dynamics can play out without added harm. If I am present for my own, my job is to let the remaining energy go where it does the most good. One more sentence of love said out loud, one more instruction that saves someone hours, one more forgiveness that collapses a useless tension. I hold a final misconception up to the light because it recurs in conversations with smart, caring people. They say, but I can't imagine non-existence. Of course I can't. Imagination is a property of existence. The inability to picture unconsciousness is not evidence against it. It is evidence that picturing is the wrong tool for the question. The relevant observation is that each night in dreamless sleep, the first-person stream lapses. It lapses safely, reversibly, and without any internal witness to its own absence. That is not death, but it is a daily reminder that experience has edges drawn by biology. The terror often softens when I notice this, because it relocates fear to where agency still operates not at the imagined border beyond all experience, but here, while I can still act. I gather the threads and tighten the weave one more time. Life, in the sense that makes this question urgent, is a metabolically sustained, information-rich, self-correcting process in the brain and body. The continuity of the person is the continuity of that process as it rewrites itself to include the most recent moment. Death, when the brain irreversibly loses the capacity to sustain that process, is the end of the first-person stream. Matter continues. Energy dissipates according to strict accounting. Consequences propagate into other lives and structures. None of those are consolation prizes if I let them set my priorities now. They become the map by which I spend attention. And attention is just another word for life parceled into moments. I end with a candor I owe myself. I will keep a small aperture open for surprise because science is not a fortress. It is a lighthouse whose beam keeps sweeping further. If a clean, replicable, well-controlled anomaly appears something that forces me to redraw the line between mind and matter, I will redraw it gratefully. Until then, I will let the current map make me kinder, more deliberate, and less evasive. I will love people in ways that leave traces they can use. I will write and teach and repair and rest because a tired brain lies about meaning. And when I am asked, is there life after death, I will answer, as I have learned to answer, if you mean the same viewpoint continuing, the evidence says no. If you mean atoms and echoes, and the long causal wake of your choices, the evidence says yes. We live once, and exactly because of that, what we choose to make out of the once is larger than any promise of a later we cannot measure. I want to press on one last seam where physics, biology, and meaning meet, because the way I hold this question in my head changes the way I wake up tomorrow. I begin with the oldest ledger I know, written into the sky itself, stars. Every atom in me, heavier than hydrogen, was cooked in stellar furnaces and scattered by ancient explosions. Carbon for my cells, calcium for my bones, iron for my blood star products, all of them. That's not just poetic, it's the literal supply chain for bodies like ours. When I say I will return to the universe, that sentence cashes out as atoms re-entering cycles of air, water, soil, and over ridiculous spans of time, perhaps the birth clouds of new stars. But I also know that the particular arrangement that lets me say I is nothing like a star. A star is a self-gravitating, fusion-powered sphere. A mind is a metabolically sustained information, processing pattern precariously balanced in 1.5 kilograms of warm tissue. Stars end in spectacle because gravity has only a few grand exits. Minds end in quiet because they require constant, precise upkeep from chemistry and circulation. I don't confuse those categories. I simply hold them side by side to remember that my end is not the end of my matter, and that the part that mattered most to me, the first-person stream, depends on a level of organisation the universe does not preserve by default. I look again at the small power station inside my skull, about 20 watts on average, and I ask what that power buys me from moment to moment. It buys me a stable, now a stitched panorama from eyes and ears and joints that comes into focus at the right speed. It buys me a sense of authorship over my actions, rather than the dizziness of being moved by events. It buys me memory traces that survive into next week so I can keep a promise I made today. When I frame the question of afterlife in that concrete way, what machine can keep buying those experiences after the metabolic budget is gone? The answer is sober. Without energy, the dynamic alignment that produces a viewpoint doesn't hold. If someone wants to propose another substrate that picks up the bill, then they are proposing another physical system with storage for the pattern and ongoing power for the computation. If they can describe it with the same specificity we use to describe neurons and synapses, I'm listening. If they can't, then they're not adding an explanation, they're adding a hope. I don't sneer at hope, I just don't mislabel it. I notice how much of death anxiety really lives in time anxiety. I don't merely fear non-existence, I fear the unfinished task, the unspoken apology, the unkept promise, the unsaid love. That's useful fear because it can be converted into action while I'm alive. A brain is a deadline machine. It prioritizes when it feels time pressure. I use that gently to ask better questions of my day. What can I do now that increases the probability that something good persists without me? What small repair prevents a large confusion for someone else later? What can I document so that the wheel I had to invent becomes a blueprint for the next person? These sound like modest acts, and they are but modest acts. Compounded across months and years become culture, and culture is how patterns persist without a single owner. If I want the only honest continuation available to me, the continuation of consequences I have to build it on purpose, I revisit near-death narratives with a kinder, tighter lens. I take seriously that people report tunnels of light life reviews and the sense of leaving the body. I also take seriously what the visual cortex and limbic system do under hypoxia, what the thalamus does under anesthetic stress, and how predictive processing can hallucinate with utter conviction when its correction loops are compromised. The dignity in those moments is not in pretending that experience proves a metaphysical claim. It is in acknowledging the brain's capacity to produce a last blaze of meaningful imagery at the edge of failure. Nobody should dismiss the human importance of that. It is the final intelligence of a living organ trying to make coherence when coherence is most threatened. If someone returns, the story becomes part of our living data about how brains behave near their limits. If someone does not, there is no further witness. That is hard and true at the same time. I return to the strange plasticity of self because it keeps me honest about how local the eye is. Under psilocybin, subjects in safe clinical settings often report a temporary loosening of the narrative self, less rumination, more connection, a softening of the boundary between me and not me. Under deep anesthesia, the self simply lapses and no internal diary records the lapse. Under severe frontal injury, executive function and impulse control can change so profoundly that old friends say the person seems different in their moral center. Each of these cases is biologically particular and ethically delicate. Together they explain why any theory that floats the self free of the brain must do more than assert freedom. It must explain at minimum why these manipulations of neurons so reliably manipulate the thing said to be independent of neuron. I do not say this to diminish mystery. I say it to put mystery where it belongs, in how biological matter following ordinary physical rules gives rise to meaning, not in the imaginary suspension of those rules at just the moment they become inconvenient. I want to make the conservation laws argument airtight, because it's a place where wishful shortcuts hide. Energy is conserved, but specific organizations are not. If I drop a porcelain cup, I still have all the atoms and all the energy in the room's air and the shards' vibrations, but I don't have a cup. If I drop a brain by shutting off its energy and perfusion, I still have all the atoms and their heat, but I don't have a self. The thing that's missing is not a substance, it's a high-order arrangement maintained by work. This is why the physics of death is not an insult, it is a kind of reverence. It recognizes that consciousness is an extremely expensive arrangement to maintain, and that while it runs, it is the rarest known state of matter in the cosmos. That changes how I behave. It makes me gentler with other people's focus and sleep and safety, because I know what it costs them to think clearly and feel whole. It makes me craft my disagreements so they don't gratuitously damage the delicate machinery of attention on which meaning runs. I entertain the tech temptations because I live in the same century as everyone else. Cryonics promises a pause button pressed just after legal death, with the wager that future tools will repair the cellular wreckage and reboot the pattern. Mind uploading imagines a full structural scan, fine-grained enough to reconstruct not just anatomy, but the adjustable weights at trillions of synapses, then running that reconstruction on hardware. Even before ethics, the physics and biology question is, where is the demonstrated fidelity? Can we freeze then unfreeze mammalian brains with all relevant microstructure, intact at scale? Can we read and write a living brain, synaptic parameters without destroying it? Can we prove that a one-to-one structural copy of a network will run the same dynamics given the same inputs? We are not there. We may never be there. If we get closer, we will face the identity fork anyway. A revived pattern is a new first-person center, not a rescue of the original viewpoint. Knowing that in advance doesn't kill curiosity. It protects me from false comfort disguised as engineering. I linger on ritual because it is the technology our ancestors invented when silicon was stone and code was oral. The most honest rituals don't promise what physics cannot deliver. They promise what human bodies can deliver: co-regulation through shared breath and sound, reduced cognitive load through repeated familiar sequences, social anchoring through named roles and responsibilities, meaning made visible through symbols and places. If I build or inherit rituals like that, grief remains grief, but it is grief with handwriting. I prefer rituals that bind memory into action, a yearly letter to the departed where I update them on the living, a scholarship in a name that funds someone else's beginning, a family practice of telling difficult truths kindly so that important information doesn't die in silence. I don't need metaphysics for any of this. I need bodies, time and intent. I recognize that every time I say this, I risk sounding like I'm deflating wonder. The opposite is true. Finite things are where wonder becomes urgent. If I had infinite tomorrows, a sunrise could be postponed. If I have a countable, if unknown number, then a sunrise is a non-renewable event. That doesn't mean manic consumption of experiences. It means deliberately choosing experiences that deepen pattern and propagate goodness. A late night walk with a friend that finally dissolves a misunderstanding. A morning set aside to teach a skill so well that the student will never need me again. An afternoon of paperwork so that someone I love doesn't face a bureaucratic labyrinth while they're exhausted by sorrow. None of these would look grand on a cosmic billboard. All of them are in the only relevant sense immortal acts because they outlast the metabolism that produced them. I consider the last minutes again, not because I'm morbid, but because thinking clearly now affects how I and those around me will navigate them. If I am present for someone else's ending, I can make the room easy for breath, quiet for soft speech, calm for clear decision making. I can keep my phone out of sight because small glowing rectangles are entropy machines for attention. I can speak names, recall shared stories, and avoid loading my loved one with unresolved demands. If I am the one ending, I can arrange in advance to donate organs, if eligible to authorize researchers to learn ethically from my body, if I choose, and to make sure the documents speak when I can't. These are not grand gestures, they are the mechanics of love when the physics has the last word. I come back again to the compact version of the question because plain answers are the ones we can live by. Is there life after death? If by life I mean the metabolically sustained, energy-hungry process that generates a first-person point of view, then no, not for the same person, not without the living brain. If by after I mean the continued journey of my atoms through the world's cycles, then yes, with certainty in forms that are not me. If by after I mean the propagation of information and care into other minds and structures, then yes, and the strength of that yes is proportional to what I do now. I keep a small aperture open for carefully demonstrated surprises because science is a practice of being corrigible. But I will not spend this finite blaze waiting for a surprise to rescue me from the responsibility of meaning. I will use the whats I have to write pages that other minds can keep reading after my hands are still. I end with the gentlest repetition because a mind steadies itself by circling truth. I say this is it, I say this is it, and it is enough if I spend it well. I say this is it, and the after I can promise myself is written in the world lines I alter while I am here. We are the rarest matter arrangement we know alive for a blink in a cold, indifferent cosmos, and precisely because of that, we are free to fill the blink with warmth that keeps traveling after the light goes out. I want to ask the question from an angle I've been avoiding, not because it is mystical, but because it is personal. What exactly is the thing I fear losing, the thing I keep calling me, and what would it take for that thing to continue? I look at an ordinary afternoon, and I watch how the eye rises in practice. Sensory streams are messy light hits, the retina sound arrives with tiny delays, proprioception hums from muscles and joints, yet a single scene assembles with edges, depth, and a felt center. That felt center is not a place in space, it is a role in a computation. The brain predicts the next few hundred milliseconds, compares those predictions to incoming signals, and updates themselves in a loop tight enough that I experience the result as presence. When I press my finger to the table, the small lag between signal and perception disappears into a stitched now. When that loop is intact, I have authorship. When it frays, authorship fades. I notice this because after would have to recreate not only the data, but the ongoing bargaining between prediction and correction, between what I expect and what the world supplies. Without that bargaining, no continuation deserves the name. I test the claim by looking at cases where authorship loosens in ordinary life. Under jet lag and sleep loss, attention narrows and reaction times stretch. Under fever, perceptions can tilt. Under certain medications, the rails of thought that usually keep me from spiraling feel farther apart. None of this makes me less human. It makes me more honest about how local and physical the eye is. Even emotions that feel global are grounded in time-sensitive physiology. A spike of adrenaline elevates salience and narrows interpretation. A wave of oxytocin tilts trust. A slow roll of cortisol makes the future feel heavier and less tractable. If I am trying to imagine a continuation that preserves my viewpoint, I must imagine a system that preserves not a statue but a dance among many timed influences. That dance costs energy and depends on structure. It does not survive on sentiment alone. I turn toward memory because continuity without memory is a mask with no face behind it. Memory is not a warehouse, it's a living city. Some districts handle facts, others procedures, others the vivid scenes of a summer night I can still smell years later. Each district taxes the budget differently. Autobiographical memories are expensive to create and cheaper to maintain if I revisit them. Skill memories take time to engrave but run efficiently once written. Short-term buffers flicker rapidly and vanish without rehearsal. Consolidation occurs in stages, with sleep serving as the nightly public works department, strengthening some roads, letting others crumble, rerouting traffic along more efficient paths. When I learn something deeply, the change is not spiritual vapor, it's a physical retuning of synaptic strengths and microarchitecture. When I forget the decays, likewise physical proteins turn over, spine shapes change, unused connections are pruned. If an after is going to carry me forward as the same person, it must carry the specific city map and keep paying to maintain it. If it doesn't, the resident who wakes up across the river won't be me. There'll be a neighbour with uncanny similarities. I check the physics that sits behind all this in the plainest possible way. The universe permits islands of increasing order locally, as long as those islands export disorder to their surroundings. A living brain is exactly such an island. It takes in low entropy fuel and turns it into the structured business of staying coherent ion gradients, precise spike timing, replenish neurotransmitters, waste cleared away. The price is non-negotiable. Stop the inflow of usable energy and the coherence unravels. The unraveling is not malice, it's mathematics enacted in chemistry. That is why the end of the personal stream is not a shock to the laws of nature, it's their expected outcome when the bills go unpaid. We sometimes try to smuggle identity through a loophole by invoking conservation laws. If energy can't be destroyed, why can a mind be? But the thing we love isn't energy in general. It's the exceedingly particular arrangement of energy in space and time. Arrangements are not conserved. That's why a melody dies when a violin falls silent, even though the strings and air still contain energy. I ask what kind of evidence could puncture all of this and force me to redraw the map. It wouldn't be a story of a feeling alone, however sincere. It would be a story that produces specific verifiable facts that were out of reach by ordinary means. A person with flatlined readings and shielded from sensory cues later reports details planted in a high hidden place in the room and gets them right repeatedly under blinded conditions. A series of controlled sessions in which a living person receives specific information from a deceased person unknown to any participant, information later confirmed in records that were sealed at the time. A robust, independently replicated detection of a new field or particle that can carry semantic information independent of neural tissue and that can be shown to couple to matter in ways we can measure. If any of that appears under proper controls, I will make space for it without defensiveness, because loving truth means wanting to be surprised by it. But until then, the most consistent picture is that consciousness is a process implemented by a brain, not a substance that floats free when the implement ends. I admit the emotional counter-argument openly. I don't merely want information to persist. I want love to be answered with love forever. I want a kitchen table set with the same mismatched mugs, a laugh in the same voice, a set of hands that learn the same clumsy dance. Naming that doesn't make me weak. It makes me honest about the scale of the loss. Science doesn't heal that ache by denying it. It helps by telling me where I actually have leverage while I am alive. It tells me that rituals matter because nervous systems respond to rhythm and breath and touch. That sleep matters because a tired brain over-predicts threat and under-predicts benevolence. That community matters because collective attention can carry what individual attention drop. These are not consolation prizes. They are the precise places where physics and biology give me tools to be human in the face of finitude. I give the technological dreams their turn on the stage and hold them to the same standards. Cryogenic preservation imagines that if we can pause decay fast and fine enough, a future technique might repair and restart the pattern. High-resolution brain mapping imagines that if we can read every synaptic weight and microstructure, a reconstruction might run on alternative hardware. I'm not hostile to either project as research questions. I am hostile to confusing a research question with a promissory note on personal survival. The technical obstacles are immense, preserving not just cell bodies, but the nanoscale geometry that encodes plasticity, reading not just static structure, but dynamic state, proving that a structural copy will reproduce the same trajectories under similar inputs at scale. Even if all that is solved, identity forks anyway. A copy is a new first-person center that will say I, but the original stream will have ended. This isn't curmudgeonry, it's coherence. It protects me from buying hope with the currency of confusion. I come back to the most unglamorous continuation we have, because it is also the most solid consequences. The atoms in my body will rejoin the general circulation of matter, yes, but the long echo of my choices is the more interesting legacy. When I teach a skill, well, the learner's brain changes in specific material ways. When they use that skill to build something useful, the chain lengthens. When that usefulness spares someone else a mistake or a harm, the chain becomes a tree. When I write clearly, the time I spent resolving my own confusion is saved for the reader. When I muddy the water, I export entropy into their day and they pay the price. Seeing that makes ethics less about slogans and more about energy economy. A kind act is often just a very efficient intervention at a bottleneck in somebody else's process. That kind of intervention travels. I return to the body at the threshold, not to make a spectacle of it, but to be practically compassionate. In the minutes to hours when a person is dying, small choices by the living change the texture of the ending. Lowering noise reduces startle and strain. Gentle touch and speaking names anchor the fading predictive machinery to familiar patterns. Clear, calm decisions by a designated proxy prevent chaos from consuming precious attention. If brain death criteria are met and organs can be donated, the gift is literal life for others. No metaphor is needed. These are acts that turn endings into beginnings in the only way that survives scrutiny. We sometimes avoid these choices because they feel clinical. I think they are sacred in the strictest sense because they convert love into actions with measurable lasting effects. I take a candid look at digital ghosts because they're already here. Systems trained on my words can animate a version of my voice or style. They can comfort or confuse. The ethical line is bright aid, the living label, the artifice never impersonate consent or identity. If I want to leave something genuinely helpful, I can leave well-organized knowledge notes with reasons code, with comments, instructions, with context, family histories, with dates and phonetic spellings, so names aren't lost. Those are continuations that respect truth and agency, rather than trading on resemblance. I test my fear one more time against experience I already have. Each night during stretches of dreamless sleep, the first-person stream vanishes. There is no inner witness to the absence. There is only the fact that upon waking, a process with access to yesterday's records resumes. The lapse is safe and reversible because the underlying organs stayed perfused and capable. Death is not sleep, but sleep is a daily reminder that experience is a property of a running process, not a permanent light behind the eyes. Remembering this doesn't erase fear, it moves it to a place where it can be worked with, not at an imagined edge that can't be imagined, but here, in how I spend my day while I still can. I try finally to answer in the plainest language I can keep. Is there life after death? If by life I mean the metabolically powered synchronized information processing activity that produces a first-person viewpoint, then when the brain irreversibly ceases to support that activity, viewpoint ends. If by after I mean the fate of matter, then my atoms continue in the world's cycles as air and water and soil, and in unimaginable spans, perhaps part of other stars. If by after I mean the propagation of information, skill, care and structure into other minds and institutions, then yes, and the scale of that continuation depends on the choices I make now. I keep a small, principled openness for new evidence that could expand the map, because the practice of science is a commitment to be incorrigible. But I refuse to mortgage the hours I have to hopes that won't submit to the same discipline I use everywhere else. I end as I have to with the gentlest repetition a mind uses to steady itself. I say this is it. I say this is it, and I will spend it like the rare currency it is. I say this is it, And if there is to be an after, with my fingerprints on it, I will write it into other lives now, while the heart still pushes and the 20 watts still burn. We are brief, and in that brevity lies the exact kind of meaning that can stand any test I know. The most scientific conclusion is this: the continued existence of a first-person mind depends on an operating human brain, and when the brain irreversibly loses that capacity, the first-person stream ends. This model explains the full pattern of observations we can test how anesthesia, hypoxia, seizures, drug sleep injury, and neurodegeneration predictably alter or switch off awareness. How specific lesions change memory temperament and moral judgment. How unity of self-phrase when the integrating pathways are cut. And how near-death phenomenology arises from stressed neural circuits rather than access to information beyond the senses. It is consistent with thermodynamics, which permits local order only while energy flows, and with conservation laws which safeguard total energy but not the fragile high-order arrangements that constitute a conscious mind. It makes clear, refutable predictions there should be no verifiable acquisition of new external information by a person whose brain activity is absent and whose senses are blocked. There should be no reliable, blinded recovery of facts from deceased individuals that exceed chance once leakage is controlled. There should be no measurable mind-carrying field coupling strongly to matter that somehow evaded detection in experiments already sensitive to such effects. Those predictions have held. What does continue after death is matter which re-enters physical cycles and consequences which persist as information in other brains' records, institutions and lives. I leave principled room for revision. If careful, independently replicated studies demonstrate awareness detached from living neural tissue. I will update this conclusion, but on present evidence, the most accurate, least speculative answer is that personal consciousness does not survive death, while the causal wake of our choices and the atoms of our bodies assuredly do.